Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing great conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor in and advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. Now, we learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact each week. Today's fun fact: ChatGPT is now one of the 50 most visited websites in the world. Usage soared to 100 million daily active users in January, dramatically eclipsing the time to achieve that same milestone by even the fastest growing social media platforms. For reference, TikTok and Instagram required 9 months and 2.5 years, respectively, to reach 100 million daily active users. As always, I'll share the link to the full article in the show notes. But now shifting to today's discussion. It's been some time since we last discussed AI in healthcare, with great guests like Paddy Padmanabhan from Demo Consulting and Dipanita Das from Sorcero. Doctors, I've said in the past, are becoming computers with scalpels, and AI is assisting with everything from robots performing surgical procedures to AI reading x-rays. One of the most fundamental challenges physicians face is accurately diagnosing health issues and prescribing the right course of action. The best answers are often trapped in historical data. Just imagine the power of a system that could organize and surface the best answers at the moment of truth when patients are interacting with caregivers. Well, today's guests are using machine learning to turn real-world data from past interactions into insights. Brigham Hyde is the co-founder and CEO of Atropos Health, which has commercialized the Insights Exchange for healthcare. Brigham has raised a $14 million Series A in August of last year from an exceptional group of investors, including Breyer Capital and Emerson Capital. We're also joined by an early user of Atropos, Dr. John Halamka, president of the Mayo Clinic Platform. Dr. Halamka has been developing and implementing healthcare information strategy and policy. For more than 25 years, he specializes in AI, the adoption of electronic health records, and the secure sharing of healthcare data for care coordination, population health, and quality improvement. Dr. Halamka was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2020. And for AI and the Future of Work trivia buffs, this is only the fourth episode in over 185 that we've recorded with multiple guests. The last one you may recall was with the great founders of Tuso, Ciro Greco and Jacopo Tagliabue, which was, I'd say, one of our more memorable. I encourage you to download that one from the archives. And let's see, without further ado, Brigham and Dr. Halamka, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's kick off the conversation by having you each share a little bit more about your backgrounds and how you got into this space.
Well, Brigham, please go ahead.
Sure thing. Thanks for having us, Dan, and great to be on with you, John. Exciting topic to discuss. I spent most of my career working in health technology and health data, including co-founding Atropos, helping spin it out of Stanford University, and also now operating as its CEO. I've built businesses in this space going back about 15 years, including companies like Concert AI in the oncology real-world data space, Decision Resources Group, and Eversana. And I would say throughout that, I feel like I've been on a journey first to find healthcare data in the early days of my work, help bring it together, aggregate it, cleanse it, normalize it. And in the last 5 years, really getting into building the predictive layers and insight layers on top of that. And I think Atropos represents a really important sort of innovation in that layering, but is really just a big part of an ecosystem that John and many others have helped build over the last 20, 25 years. What I'm seeking is the ability to bring evidence and prediction to the point of care and make it useful and actionable for physicians, empowering them to make better decisions, more evidence-informed decisions and do it without impacting their daily work, and ultimately to improve patient outcomes by doing it. But thanks for having me, and glad to be part of the discussion.
Well, hey, Dan, so I'll give you some very personal comments about how I got here. So I'm just turning 61. When I was 14 or so, I first built that Altar 8800. Remember that popular electronics cover story? And I said, the world of analog and the world of digital are really not separate entities. In fact, as we start to think of healthcare, shouldn't we be able to represent any human signal in digital form? And so what that has implied is that for more than 40 years, I have been working at that intersection of IT and healthcare, having run the Harvard Medical School, a number of its hospitals, IT organizations for more than 2 decades, and then joining Mayo Clinic to begin the platform activity of creating that virtuous ecosystem where we can build AI to scale and validate it using tools and processes. So yes, it's been a multi-decade journey, but I can tell you this, we couldn't deal with things like the emerging generative AI unless I had that 40 years to prepare for it.
Describe the partnership between Atropos and Mayo Clinic Platform.
Well, sure. I was going to say, Brigham, you want to start, and then I'll add to it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Really a conversation that began with Dr. Halamka and other folks at the Mayo Clinic going back almost 2 years now, looking at what John and the team had developed in terms of the Mayo Cloud platform. And that platform layer that they'd invested in and really led on sort of best practices and approaches. We were thinking about, what's the app layer on top of that? And how do we leverage what's being built there to bring additional value? For Atropos, our technology is a federated cloud-based technology. That's a fancy way of saying it installs in your environment, and in this case could work directly and securely with what the Mayo Cloud platform had developed. And our main focus was, let's add speed to the equation. And what I mean by speed is speed of insight. So a doctor could ask a question like ChatGPT, although I want to be very clear, we don't use LLMs to do this, but can ask a text-based question and rapidly, for us right now, within a day, get back a response in the form of a observational research study, answering the question personalized to the patient information in front of that clinician. And that last 5 yards of the speed element are what we're great at. And we rely on the strength of the development in the Mayo platform to have great data in a secure environment to build upon that. I think you can add to this, Sean, we're one of many applications you hope to spring from this platform. Some you guys develop yourselves, some you do with partners. But the value is, now that we have the platform like the one John's built, how can we add the application layer and bring that value right to the point of care?
Well, very well said. I'll start with a general comment and then go more specific. Generally, if you're going to do AI to scale ML ops lifecycle, you're going to need solution developers like Atropos. You're going to need a distributed data network of data that I describe as having great depth, the kinds of clinical data, breadth, the number of patients, but spread, the heterogeneity. That is, do you have patients from all geographies, all incomes, all educations? These are the things that are going to make your model fair and unbiased. And then you need to be able to deploy a model in clinical workflow so it actually makes a difference to providers and patients. So with Atropos, as Brigham said, their notion is they can take a very large corpus of training data, and for a patient you're seeing today, derive a prognostogram from the data of the patients of the past. Right. And I often highlight this example of my mom, and this is not a HIPAA violation. Don't worry. Full permission has been granted. In July of 2022, my mother had a brain abscess, and that brain abscess was treated with 9 weeks of antibiotics and cured. But the problem was there was so much confusion in figuring out, wow, she's got this thing in her brain. What is it? Where did it come from? Well, the answer is, if you were looking at 10 million or 25 million patients like my mom and understanding their care journey, you'll really accelerate what tests to order, what therapies to consider, what diagnoses may be possible. And unfortunately for her care, we did not have the Atropos prognostigram. So it was done as medical diagnosis is often done. A little bit of a slightly chaotic approach. She ultimately got the cure, but it wasn't as efficient as it might be. And as you heard from Brigham, Atropos is a solution developer sitting on top of this Mayo platform and therefore can convert this historical privacy protected data into wisdom.
And let me add to John's example here. What happens now, right? As John said, and how do people try to get these answers? And while there are some self-service tools out there, there are dashboards, there are other applications that will be built. The fundamental truth is a physician does not have time to sit there and design a study, click the buttons, write the code even required to get that insight out. And the innovation at Atropos and the way we leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence is that we remove all of that from their workflow. It feels like they're consulting a colleague, right? And in fact, our results are delivered back in the form of an e-consult. All they have to do is the knowledge work. What's the question I'm trying to answer? What's the thought? In the case of John's mother, what's the whodunit I'm trying to solve? They just have to come up with the question. Our technology is all focused around removing all the human labor work required to answer that question and make that extremely fast and automated. And the secret sauce there is you have to meet the timing of the point of care to make it relevant. If John's mother's physician had to wait 2 weeks to get an answer back from a data analysis, or even months as it takes in some cases for observational research, it would not have impacted her care. But if it's as easy as writing a few sentences like an email to a peer, and you get an answer back in a day or so that's informed by those millions of patients, that's what allows this to impact that point of care decision.
So today when I go into my, let's say my GP at Kaiser, it's about as impersonal and robotic an experience as could be. I get the sense that they're on a clock, and the sooner they can get me in and out, the better. And if it's an accurate diagnosis, great, all the better. But if it's not, that's fine too, as long as it's quick. So whether it's, John's mom and a serious health issue or, routine stuff that I go in for, how does something like Atropos improve that patient caregiver experience?
Yeah, I think this point really resolves around the issue of evidence, okay? We talk about evidence-based medicine. And when you go to your GP, there's probably clear guidelines for what they're supposed to do, whether it's the differential diagnosis or it's choosing a therapy. And if you think about where those rubrics come from, they come from evidence produced by clinical trials. And clinical trials are the gold standard, and I think always will be. However, you also have to acknowledge the fact that most patients would have been excluded from most clinical trials. The estimates are about 70 to 75% of the population would not meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria of those trials. Not to mention the fact that how we decide what trials to do is often driven by things like drug development and other elements. So we're systematically excluding most of the patient population to develop this evidence. And by the way, there's good and bad reasons for that. I'm not sort of yelling at the sky about that situation. It's just the reality. And so our belief at Atropos is this problem, it can be described as the evidence gap. There's just not enough clinical trial evidence to inform personalized care. And that's when we need to turn to observational research, patient-level data. And our point is, let's find a way to deliver that personalized evidence very rapidly again to the point of care. So back to your GP. When you come in, and when I talk to friends and associates outside this industry, they sort of can't believe this is true, but they're not even attempting to personalize your care decision. And if there happens to be a guideline gap, like maybe there was no trial for a specific situation you're in, they really have nowhere to turn to. And I find when we talk to physicians, they're relying on their knowledge base, but they're essentially extrapolating from experience to determine what should happen when those gaps exist. Our argument is that doesn't have to be the case. We can personalize that, we can localize it, and we can respond, in time to those needs. So, I think that's the core of it. We just don't have enough evidence. I'll make one comment about ChatGPT and LLMs related to this. If you think about using that technology today to, answer medical questions. And there's a recent publication by my colleague Morgan Cheatham where, ChatGPT actually passed the step 2 medical exam, right? So you're thinking maybe it's getting smart enough. The reality of that, though, is that's relying on all the published evidence, which we just said was incredibly insufficient. So there's no way for the LLMs, no matter how good they are, to be able to answer all the relevant medical questions if they don't have access to more evidence. So our hope is to raise the corpus of not only content that can be out there, but also enable that personalization element.
So, Brigham, I'm guessing that our listeners don't know how medical testing is actually done. It's done in 3 steps.
Yep.
The first step is, can you regurgitate the information that exists in textbooks today? And that's what ChatGPT was asked to do. Not a surprise that it could regurgitate text from textbooks, because step 2 is more about then applying the knowledge to problem solving. And step 3 is clinical. So that is where I wouldn't be too impressed with generative AI simply regurgitating text from the past.
Yeah, we have a research project underway with my co-founder, Nigam Shah, your colleague, John, from Stanford. And we're actually going to do it. We're going to go head to head. We're going to ask a question that we've gotten from the point of care and we've been able to answer using real world evidence. And we're going to ask ChatGPT and we're going to see what each one says. By the way, the probably most intriguing part about that is when ChatGPT is aware there is not enough evidence to answer a question. And how honest will it be about that, or biased will it be? So look for some upcoming research from us on this. But it's not that as John said, I think the ability to regurgitate textbook, great. The ability to fill the gap and come up with an answer when there is not evidence out there to train on, how are you going to come up with an answer for clinical, for instance? So,
but Dan, here's something fun to try. Go to ChatGPT, or your listeners go do this now, and ask the question, should ChatGPT be used for medical diagnosis? We all know the answer will be different every time, but I did this yesterday and it said no.
Right, exactly.
A rare time when ChatGPT is right.
That's right, and honest.
That is not a hallucination. So all AI is really a data problem. Talk to us about how you source this evidence data, and more importantly, who's responsible if Atropos makes a decision that leads to some detrimental outcome.
Hey, why don't I start with the sourcing of the data, then you can talk about the Atropos angle, because the data issue is really hard. I have been a physician since the 1980s. And I can tell you the quality of data recorded in electronic health record systems is just bad, right? I mean, there's men having babies and women having prostatectomies and people living to 150 and having 3 kidneys removed, right? So the challenge is Mayo Clinic spent 5 years curating, normalizing, and cleaning its longitudinal data, de-identifying it, and then modality by modality, we moved it over to a cloud container for the use with algorithm development. Started with structured data, then unstructured, then telemetry like EKG signals, then images, then omics, then digital pathology. So think about this. It's a journey and it takes constant vigilance to make sure the training sets are good enough. Last thing I'll say is even Mayo's 10 million patients, not sufficient to give you an unbiased, useful algorithm. Mayo has partnered with Mercy Health. They're Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, 15 million patients there. Got about another 5 health systems in the pipeline. By the end of 2023, we're hoping about 100 million geographically dispersed, de-identified, curated records. And that's the kind of thing that Atropos can really learn from.
And I think it informs why we're so excited about the partnership, right? I mean, we want to be working with and installed on the best data platforms with those who are investing to enrich the quality of the data. Our approach is through something we call the Atropos Evidence Network, of which is one of those pieces. And the idea is let's sit on all the best data sets we can. We have other partnerships with ASCO CancerLink, for example, a large oncology data set. And when it comes time to ask a question, okay, the question comes up, well, what data set should I use? What we've developed to deal with this is, first, incredibly transparent methods, very rigorous and sophisticated statistical methodologies to remove confounders and bias. And we publish all of those, and they're all publicly available and have been through peer review. The second thing we're now doing is we're doing something we call a data fitness score. So think of this as a credit score. And it's a credit score not on the data set in general. It's a credit score on the match of the question to the data set. Is this data set appropriate for this question? And it's meant to give the user back the evaluation of, what's the quality of the data I'm using to get this answer. Another piece that we do is you enable multi-data set analysis by which you can then do meta-analysis. So we could run it on multiple and then do a powered Cochrane or meta-analysis on top, which can, again, look to correct those. But as John said, there's always going to be some bias. There's always going to be some problems and errors in this data. The key is to be transparent. The other thing that this does is when we talk to data partners like the Mayo Cloud Platform, we're able to provide back insight to them on their own data from sort of an impartial stance. We have thousands of questions that have been asked of our data or of our system. And when we work with a data partner, we can rerun those questions and say, how'd you do on all the questions? And where'd you do well? Where were you well fit for? Well, where weren't you? Ultimately, what that lets me tell John and his team is, hey guys, you're really strong over here. But hey, maybe there's some weaknesses over here. If you added socio-determinants of health data to your stack, you could answer X more questions. And what's valuable about that, and I'd love to hear your opinion, John, I think what that does, it helps justify investment in the data infrastructure, right? Because if you know how many more questions you're able to answer by adding a linked data set or curating or enriching, or just how much better you are than the next data set, that helps validate the investment you're making. And I think ultimately it will show market value for the data sets.
Yeah, so we have a quarter by quarter Pareto analysis of what data we will add, and we look at impact, exactly as you say. Well, how many patients will this help? What disease will this help cure? And since there's literally an infinite amount of healthcare data you could add to a longitudinal record, you can't just do it all simultaneously. And it has to be prioritized exactly as you say.
Yeah, and you asked the second part to your question I want to make sure I hit, which is who's responsible for the impact of answering a question. So I want to be super clear about one thing here, which is that what we provide is an information service today. We're showing you the answer to what the question was on this data, and that's as far as we go. We describe the results, we describe the methods and the statistics, and we'll tell you what it says. We are not telling you what to do as a result of that. We're trying to give you insight and impact into that. And I would liken it, the way we've developed it, what do physicians do today without our service, right? As John said, they rely on their training. They might go to something like Up to Date, where there might be an editorialized summary of a given issue. They're already consuming information, by the way, some of that already backed by observational research. So what we're doing is just delivering them that information result, and then they take over on what to do with it. And I think most physicians view it as an input into their discussion. They'll think of the guidelines, think of the trials. They may factor some of this view into their decision making.
So just make sure I'm understanding the data set. So Dr. Halamka, it sounds like you're using humans to vet the data before it enters the machine learning pipeline. And by doing that, you're only including evidence where the diagnosis was accurate. Is that right?
Well, it's a combination of humans, NLP, and underlying ML to curate the data, right? And so we can write rules. I think all of us would agree. We often know when a baby is born, but typically you don't die at the hospital you were born at. So even though it's a security death index, we don't know when you die. So we let's just write a rule that a data scientist will remove all patients greater than 120 years old, right? Or a data scientist will remove anyone who has their kidney removed more than twice, right? So there's this curation that is about writing rules, but a lot of the data cleaning is also done by NLP. So that is, if we're going to de-identify the data, this is a made-up example, of course, but what if I said a medical chart started with the sentence, "This former governor of New York"? Well, I think we would all agree that's not so de-identified. It doesn't mention a name, an address, a phone number, but there aren't that many governors of New York. So we would, with NLP, and this is an automated process, change that to what we call hiding in plain sight. This former congressperson from West Virginia. So there's a bunch of automation that also runs on the data to prepare it for use with ML models.
That's a very hard problem when PII is involved. It's one thing when it's structured data, but unstructured data where you have, international forms of PII, what's an address? Well, it's very different depending on what country or phone number, or, what if it's a substring of a social security number or a credit card number? It can easily seep into a free text field. It sounds like.
So what we did, we took it from April through August of 2020. Well, it was very hard. We used a partner company to help us with that. And they are really one of the leaders in NLP and DID. And then we hired Brad Malin, who is the world's expert in DID and re-ID, professor at Vanderbilt, to then examine and inspect the results. And he certified our unstructured data as 99.6% de-identified. So as you point out, you could, what if somebody, I'm going to make this up. What if somebody had a 6-digit phone number? Well, is that PII or not? Because you dial it and nothing happens, but maybe because it's 6 digits, it does help you with a search space, right? So you'll always, to your point, find a little leaking, but 99.6, it's not so much.
Yeah, let me offer a perspective here, having lived in this space a long time. The innovations and so the systemized approach that John's taking and others, but I think what they're doing with Mayo is as good as we've seen it done. I think this issue of HIPAA risk, while not gone, is heavily contained at this point. And why I say that is, let's take our application. We're sitting on top of John's already 99.6 certified de-identified data, right? And we're sitting in the Mayo platform inside all their security protocols. However he wants it, that's great. I don't ever need to move an individual record to produce my result, right? And my result is in aggregate. So the idea of needing to ship around patient identity, I think the infrastructure is there. And I would point to things like both, of course, cloud computing and federated models, but also things like Datavant or Health Verity doing DID, Mirador, and folks like John mentioned do statistical de-identification. And I would argue that the NLP technologies, I don't know which one you use, John, but I'll shout out a few names. Both Google and Amazon have great platforms for this that have come a long way. John Snow Labs is excellent at this. So I just think the layers and what John and others have built, I think these platforms can solve that, which, by the way, is now starting to open up opportunities globally where things like GDPR and other things are more of an issue. So it's not that I don't stay up nights worrying about it. It's not that it doesn't need to be paid close attention to, but the platforms built in the last 5 years and the technologies and even just the approach is putting this in a much safer place. By the way, nobody is happier about that than us, right? I mean, I remember the early days of data. The first time I received EMR data, it was identified, shipped to me in the mail on a hard drive, and I had to lock it in a closet with a certain lock setup to meet HIPAA requirements. And by the way, that was terrifying. I didn't want to do any of that, right? So just having the infrastructure we now have through the Mayo platform and some others, I think we're in a much better place on all that. And just one last note on curation and why this is important to curate, not just to protect identity, but to process unstructured data. I'll tell the story of Concert AI and our partner Tempest and what we did with CancerLink. Flatiron had to do this as well. I mean, we literally had to, in secure environment setups, under BAA, which is a way of sort of maintaining security under access to identified data, you would have to have nurses and clinicians read the notes to figure out what stage the patient was at for an oncology patient on a given day, because it doesn't say that in the structured information. And anytime you're in technology and you find yourself with hundreds of humans having to cull through things, you think, well, maybe we haven't come that far. But I think there's advances on the NLP side for that. I also think there's structures that allow that part to be done safely. In some cases, that enrichment is extremely important. If you're doing an oncology outcome study, and my endpoint is progression-free survival, so which drug has better progression-free survival? In a clinical trial, I can be assured that somebody actually documented the stage and said an endpoint was met. In EMR data, you have to go to the literal radiology note to figure this out. So every time I think we're in the magical world of AI and the future is here, I'm reminded that a lot of that data enrichment stuff is still really important. And this gets to data provenance, which I know is something John cares deeply about. If we're going to use data to do studies, whether it's a synthetic control arm that might go to the FDA, or it's even just to inform, an observational question at the point of care, we need to know how that data was created, enriched, and we need to know the traceability of that, and ultimately be able to be transparent about that. And that's just crucial to understanding. Back to data grading. How do I know that that they chose to stage the cancer patient the same way this other data set did? Because that is crucial to interpreting the outcomes.
So, Dr. Halamka, I want to know, as a medical doctor, someone who took the Hippocratic Oath, and then also as a partner of Atropos, using data to make these automated decisions for caregivers, how do you think about the trade-off between a false positive, which is what we've been talking about? What if the AI gives the wrong answer? But there's also a risk and a downside of a false negative, where the system is erring on the side of being cautious and actually has the right answer, but it doesn't provide it to the caregiver. How do you think about balancing the two of those at the moment of truth when, patient's outcome is at risk?
Well, sure. I'll answer this in a couple of ways. So recognize that I went to medical school in the 1980s. Do you know a few things have changed since then? And what I tell people is 50% of what I learned in medical school is wrong. I just don't know which 50%. And so what you'd want if you were making medical decisions in 2023 is you'd like the corpus of historical patients like the one in front of you analyzed and distilled to a list of possibilities, right? Not a diagnosis, but a list of possibilities. And then your clinical judgment and your integration of all the factors comes to play. So just getting back to myself, because there were many diseases not even described in the 1980s that you have to consider today, I actually don't think that this is really a false negative problem. Yes, that's always a worry, but it's going to give me a laundry list to select from. It won't make the selection for me.
That's right.
To err on the side of what we call coverage, expand coverage, provide an answer most of the time. It might sometimes be wrong, but err on the side of providing an answer.
Exactly.
How do you think about that, Brigham?
I start with methods, right? So the statistical techniques you use, the ability to identify and uncover bias, use and interpret things like odds ratios, confidence intervals, values, And by the way, this has been a big part of the story for Atropos. The next generation of doctors, John, I hope, are going to be trained with informatics expertise and understand even better how to interpret results. It's one of the reasons why we provide our results in the form of a consult, because we want somebody to be able to explain the how sure question, the risk of false negative, false positive, right? And transparently show that. And again, it's transparency, it's best in breed methods, and then the ability to interpret that. We're at some institutions now, we're actually being included in the medical training programs for residents and fellows. Like, teach them how to ask a good question, right? Teach them how to interpret what comes back statistically and make that part of the everyday. And I think the next generation of physicians can be armed in a place where this is something they know how to look at, interpret, and place correctly in the continuum of evidence they need to look at.
So guys, believe it or not, we're almost out of time. This one flew by. So it happens when it's multiple guests.
It's fun.
But I'm not letting you go without answering one last question for me. And this is an important one. So let's say we're having a version of this conversation in 2033. Here we are in March of 2023. I got to say, I envision a time when the traditional hospital and a lot of the artifacts of legacy healthcare go away. And somehow, you're the experts, but somehow I feel like healthcare comes to me rather than me having to seek it out. In that world where, maybe it's science fiction, I don't know, you tell me, but where there's less friction associated with the patient getting care, what's the role that Atropos plays? And is that science fiction, or what are we talking about in 10 years with regard to the delivery of care?
So remember, Dan, William Gibson told us the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So what you just described went live at Mayo Clinic in 2020, right? So we have advanced care at home where we come to you to do the emergency department evaluation. If you need to be admitted, we admit you to your living room. And then with remote patient monitoring, with protocols, dashboards, command centers, a team of hospital professionals in Jacksonville, Florida, that's where our command center is monitoring today over 150 patients a day in their living rooms and discharging them with the same outcomes, quality, and safety as a bricks and mortar experience. We've already now discharged more than 20,000 patients this way. So, of course, we believe that's the answer. Our next project is called Cancer Care Beyond Walls, delivering end-to-end cancer care and chemotherapy in your living room. And I'll call it as care of the future becomes accessible and with less friction. The answer is that it's going to be patient first care the way you would want it for your family, but it will be backed with the technological improvements we've all been working on to ensure that it is safe and high quality.
Yeah, and I think, John describes it well. They've been at this, is what I would describe. I view us as, one important application in that suite. But as John said, I think it's here. You can achieve the care experience, be informed by the power of the institution of Mayo Clinic without having to come to the four walls, right? And that's true today. My part about it is that what makes that successful often is to be able to have additional evidence for care in those moments and actually be able to make better decisions right along that continuum. One of the effects we've seen with physicians using Atropos is you're essentially upskilling them, right? They don't necessarily need to refer out or escalate, right? They have the information that they need. And I think that's one crucial component to the virtualization of care, is being able to upskill those settings, empower them with, all the power of every patient who's ever been seen at Mayo Clinic. I mean, the delivery of that into those settings is our part to play. But again, there's a bigger mode. And as John said, that platform that they've developed is amazing and already in play. So, we hope to add to the evidence continuum that helps drive it.
William Gibson was right, it turns out. Now, I envision a time when until I need a procedure or until I need a prescription written, I could potentially be the consumer of Atropos data. I know that's probably not something you're contemplating today, but how far-fetched is that?
It's not something we do today, but it is happening. And let me tell you how it's happening already. When a clinician is trying to instruct care for a patient, and the patient who already went to Dr. Google comes in and says, well, why am I not taking drug X, right? And they're able to put a personalized report, personalized to them, in front of them in the doctor's office and say, hey, look, I know you heard this is great, but here's why. We looked at thousands, tens of thousands, millions of patients like you, and turns out that's not the right choice. What we have heard is that's called shared decision-making in the medical community. When you have an Atropos report to do that conversation goes a lot better, and it's much more likely that the patient will stick to it. this also comes up around like, hey, do I need the expensive drug or can I take the generic? What if I have to factor in, the financial circumstances of a patient? And again, this is a great way to help justify this. I think longer term, is there a 23andMe version of Atropos that somebody could order? Perhaps I think, but I prefer today for it to be guided by a physician than used in shared decision making.
Guys, I learned a lot today. We're just getting started. I would love it if you'd come back sometime and maybe give us an update as the partnership matures.
Love to.
Absolutely. And as you pointed out, things are moving so fast that, hey, call us next quarter. We'll tell you what we've learned.
And I think until I wake up with a third kidney, I'm gonna trust what the results from Atropos say. Good stuff, guys. Where can the audience learn more about the work that you're doing together?
So Mayo Clinic Platform has a website, mayoclinicplatform.org, and you'll see blogs, daily articles, and summaries of our latest knowledge and wisdom activities.
And for Atropos, atroposhealth.com, check us out there. Follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And another exciting thing, a lot of the studies we produce, even for a single request, they go on to be published in the literature. So stay tuned on the literature and conference circuit. You'll be seeing a lot more from us.
Brilliant. Well, we really are all rooting for you both to succeed.
Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for today on AI and the future of work. Of course, we are back next week with another fascinating guest.